Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the League of Women Voters Climate Change speaker series. We are so happy to have you all here with us today. We are expecting a large crowd, so welcome, and please keep yourself muted while you're here so we can make sure the discussion isn't interrupted in any way. My name is Michelle Singer. I am the Adult Programs Coordinator for the Kellogg-Hubbard Library, and it is my pleasure to host this discussion tonight. We are recording this program. So if you want to see it afterwards, or someone that you know wants to see it afterwards, you can find this recording on our Kellogg-Hubbard Library YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for the next 3 talks that are going to be in this series, you can go to the Kellogg-Hubbard Library Adult Programs page on our website, and you can register for the Zooms right on there. And I will put those links in the chat. Speaking of chat, because we have so many people and we know that you're going to have so many questions, we ask that you do put your questions in the chat at any time during the program. Tom McKone, our moderator tonight, will keep an eye on those questions, and he will launch those questions in the Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to do that. We are very happy to have all our panelists here with us tonight. Thank you to them for being here, and we are pleased to have Tom McKone as our moderator. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Welcome everyone to the impacts of climate change on agriculture and ecology. Last month's program, What Climate Means to You, provided an overview of how climate change is affecting us in Vermont. Scientists began warning us decades ago that the huge quantities of carbon monoxide that human activity is releasing into the atmosphere is creating an enhanced greenhouse effect that increases the overall temperature of the planet and leads to dangerous changes in climate. Those changes range from the increased intensity and frequency of storms, flooding, and melting glaciers to the less obvious, all the way down to changes in the moisture of soil. There is a long list of ways in which climate change is affecting us. In 2020, Vermont enacted the Global Warming Solutions Act, which in the next year led to the creation of the Vermont Climate Council and the state's initial climate action plan. One of the 5 impact areas addressed by the climate action plan is resilient working and natural lands, preparing farms, forests, and ecosystems for climate change. And that's the topic we're focusing on this evening, the effects of climate change on our farms, forests, wildlife, and overall environmental quality of life. This evening's 4 panelists will help us better understand the challenges we face, how we are addressing them, and what we need to do. I'll introduce them in a minute. After I introduce them, they'll each have a few minutes to talk about their work and efforts that they're involved in. I'll ask follow-up questions, and they may ask each other questions or add to each other's answers. We hope that you will join the conversation also. I encourage you to use the chat at any time to make comments or to ask questions. I'll be following the comments and questions, as Michelle said, and we'll include as many as we can during the program. Although we're dealing with sometimes complicated issues, please keep your comments and questions as clear and brief as possible. We're more likely to be able to include a clear, brief comment or question than one that is more involved. So now I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists. Jim Shallow is the Director of Strategic Conservation Initiatives for the Nature Conservancy's Vermont chapter. Throughout his career, Jim has advanced forest and wildlife conservation in Vermont, including working for Audubon, Vermont. At Audubon, Vermont, in partnership with the state's Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation, he led the Forest Bird Initiative that developed the award-winning Foresters for the Birds silviculture guides. Jim is a resident of Richmond, where he lives with his spouse, Carol. Jillian Liner is the Director of Conservation for Audubon, Vermont. Jillian's career in conservation started at Audubon, New York, where she held several positions, including Director of Conservation. This past year, she shifted her focus across Lake Champlain, and joined the Audubon, Vermont team Jillian is co-author of Important Bird Areas of New York, Habitats Worth Protecting, a reference book for groups looking to protect bird habitat. Joshua Faulkner is research assistant professor with UVM Extension, and he also coordinates the Farming and Climate Change program in the UVM Extension Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Joshua does applied research and outreach to farmers and others on soil, water, and nutrient-related issues across Vermont and the northeastern US. He grew up on a grass-based beef farm in West Virginia and now lives in Starksboro. Abbie Corse is the 6th generation to farm the Corse Farm Dairy, a certified organic grazing dairy at 2,000 feet in the hills of southern Vermont. Abbie is a passionate grazier who splits her time between farming, raising kids, and advocating for a more just, equitable, and climate-resilient food system. She currently serves as the Farm and Forest Sector Representative to the Vermont Climate Council. And now we're going to go on to our panelists and have them introduce their work and the efforts they're involved in. And we're going to start with Jim Shallow. Jim.
Good evening, everyone. Tom, thanks for that introduction and welcome, everyone. I think this is a great night to be doing this, given that just north of the border here, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people gathering in Montreal to discuss another global crisis going on, the loss of biodiversity, and how the global community is going to begin to address that. And so I think this subject tonight very much marries well with the conversations going on up in Montreal. And so what I thought I would do tonight is I have a couple slides to share. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but share a couple of what's going on here in Vermont, some thoughts on wildlife impacts, and then how that's affecting their habitat in the forests that we are so close to and love here in the state of Vermont. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into sharing my screen here. And as always, mess around with Zoom as it on. Hold on. See if that works well. Sorry, Tom, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Great. All right. So first, TNC's mission is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we're a global organization, and we're committed to addressing the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And here in Vermont, TNC has been working for over 60 years. We've helped protect over 300,000 acres of Vermont, about 1,000 plus miles of stream bank, and we have 52 natural areas that comprise 32,000 acres of land in 65 communities here in Vermont. TNC was a strategic partner with the UVM Gund Institute to develop the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment Report. This is a comprehensive report that documents and assesses the science of climate change and its impacts across Vermont. So if you really want to learn more about that, it's a great resource to dig into. But a couple findings worth noting here. First, climate change is here, right? It's already being felt both in human and natural communities. Vermont is warming, as Tom said, an average temperature of 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in 1900. Winters are warming more quickly, about 2.5 times more quickly than the average temperature since 1960. And Vermont is becoming wetter, with the average precipitation increasing by 21% or to about 7.5 inches since 1900 as well. Growing conditions in Vermont's forests are expected to favor more southern species, think red oak, shagbark hickory, black cherry, while our northern hardwood species like the sugar maple, yellow birch, and balsam fir will be negatively impacted. Warmer winters and wetter summers will limit forest management options, and conditions for maple sugaring will also likely decline. It's also interesting to note that reduced snowpack could also lead to increased mortality of wood frogs, spring peepers and gray tree frogs as they lose that warming cover that snow gives them during the winter when they're hibernating. And then increased precipitation events will lead to more stream flooding, which is impacting fish habitat as well as human infrastructure. So what I want to do is just tell a story of contrasting ungulates in this quick overview. Wildlife are expected to be impacted in a lot of different ways, and I believe Jillian will touch on more on birds, but moose populations are expected to decline as the temperature continues to warm. They'll see less habitat, as well as they're not as adapted to warmer temperatures, as well as we're seeing tick infestations that are latching and causing mortality in the moose population. And that's partly responsible because of the lower snowpack in the northern part of Vermont that allows those ticks to latch on to the ticks. On the flip side, hold on, the white-tailed deer are expected to increase. And because there are warmer weather, cold winters tend to be a limiting factor for our deer populations in Vermont. And that's going to have an impact on our forests. As we see more and more deer, we see more and more browse in the forest. We see regeneration failure as a result of that. And so how Vermont begins to think about and manage our forests with the idea that we're going to see more deer is something we have to be thinking about as a climate impact in our state, both in wildlife populations and our forests. We also know that, got a little lag time here. Species are on the move. I love using this slide because this is a modeling of how species ranges are projected to move and shift in the effects as our climate warms. And as you can see, things are sort of moving northward and sort of moving up this pinch point up along the Appalachian Mountains and into Vermont. And we're already seeing trees, mammals, birds move their ranges approximately 11 miles northward each decade and 30 feet up in elevation each decade. And so this slide is modeling that shift. But what it's really telling us is that this habitat, as we think about the future for wildlife, we need to maintain the places that are biologically diverse, like our forests here in the Northeast, but also make sure that they're connected so that wildlife and species can move around and readjust to the temperatures, and that our road systems and other transportation networks need to be permeable for that movement. So what can we be thinking about doing with this? Vermont really has this opportunity in front of us. We have 80% of our state is forested. This forest can play a critical role in maintaining habitat for our wildlife, but making sure that it's connected is going to be really important going forward. But it also has this great opportunity for us because our forests pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in their soils and in the trunks and their leaves. And we know that nature playing this role can play about 1/3 of what we need to do to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius that we believe as a global community we need to do to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. So we have a great opportunity here to be thinking about how we can use our forests to store carbon, improve the management of our forests so that more carbon can be stored in it and that habitat's being improved, and make sure that they're connected across the landscape. So maybe as we get into the conversation here in a few minutes, we can explore that more. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Jim. Jillian is going to go next for us.
Hi, everyone. Jillian Liner here. I'm the Director of Conservation for Audubon, Vermont, like Tom said. Thank you, Tom, for the intro. Happy to be here with the rest of the panelists. I realize I might be a little biased coming from Audubon, but I think birds are the best indicator of ecosystem health. They're found just about everywhere. They are extremely well studied and they're very accessible. Hopefully some of you out there are bird watchers. Maybe some of you are participating in the Christmas bird count that is happening right now. I've been working with Audubon for about 20 years on a variety of conservation efforts. And today, climate is a consideration in everything we do. The actions that we're promoting, the conservation programs we have going on right now, when we're thinking about what do we need to be doing, we're thinking about how climate is impacting us today, our birds and habitats, and also what the future might look like and what actions we need to be taking now to address what our future climate might be. There are a number of studies out there that have summarized, and actually, in fact, the bird conservation community is pretty well coordinated and regularly get together to kind of assess species and put out reports on how birds are doing. Some of the recent reports, relatively recent, there was a 3 billion bird report that was put out that looked at a variety of data sets, some of which, community scientists participated in, volunteers, that showed that we've lost 1 in 4 birds since the 1970s. So species across the continent and even ones that were common. Really recently, just this past year, we had the State of the Birds that came out, which again is just a report that summarizes how birds are doing, those that are in the greatest need, and actions that we can be taking to address them. And that report had some, findings in terms of how groups of birds are doing, like forest birds or waterfowl or shorebirds, but it also identified about 70 what they termed tipping points bird species, and those were ones that have collectively lost 2/3 of their population in the past 50 years, and then are on track to lose another 50. And some of the birds relevant to Vermont that were identified in that report were bicknell's thrush and golden-winged warbler and chimney swift and bobolink. And then a few years ago, there also was a report put out by Audubon that focused on climate change. And it was called Survival by Degrees. And the study compiled data from birders and scientists, and it characterized where birds live today. So, looked at the observations of where birds are and the climate and the habitat variables and conditions associated with those, and then modeled what suitable ranges might be in the future. And it showed that 2/3 of North American birds are at risk from climate change. And a lot of those, some of them might not be a surprise, like when we think about Vermont and we think about what Jim just said in terms of a warming climate, both in summer and winter. And you might not be surprised that some of the birds, like our boreal birds, bicknell's thrush, are highly vulnerable to the changing climate. But there's also other species found in other groups of birds, including our eastern forest birds and grasslands, and some of even our coastal species. I know Vermonters might not think of themselves as supporting a lot of coast species, but we do have Lake Champlain, and we have coastal birds that occur there. And in addition to thinking about changes in kind of habitat and climate, also Jim touched on this, climate introduces other, impacts like extreme weather events, droughts, precipitation, so intermittent threats that maybe our habitats and species and us haven't been used to having to deal with, that can be pretty catastrophic. And there's even other changes, like changes in urbanization and development. There's people who are leaving coasts where they're experiencing sea level rise and regular, extreme weather events, and even more out west, people who are moving to the east, moving to Vermont because there's intense fires and the frequency and intensity is just too much, and they're seeking other places. So climate is impacting birds and habitats and us in many different ways. And you pull this all together and you think, there isn't really a bird species that isn't being impacted by climate in some way. But it's the quarter or so of our birds that have been kind of tagged as likely to experience, significant losses in their ranges, or their populations are already really small or already doing horribly. And then that layered on is just really compounding and a real concern. but birds are resilient and they can adapt. And even the science shows that if we take actions now, including reducing emissions so we can slow the warming, we are warming, we will continue to warm, but the degree to which our climate is warming, actually the projected or anticipated impacts in terms of range shifts will change. There are birds under certain warming scenarios that are predicted to leave Vermont. But then if we can slow warming and reduce the warming scenarios, they still will anticipate having ranges maintained, habitat and climate maintained for them in our state. And so that gives us hope. And that is within Audubon, our programs and when we work with people, what we try to encourage is taking action to make a difference for birds and people, ensuring that we have places where we and birds can be successful now, where they can find food, where they can find a place to nest, where they can successfully raise their family so that they then can withstand threats that are here now and then threats related to climate change. And there are species that have responded positively to people's actions, to our conservation measures like raptors and waterfowls. And so those are stories that we turn to give us hope and for us to model and continue to do the good work that we're doing.
Thank you, Jillian. I liked your comment that birds are the best indicators of ecosystem health. I'm sure we all agree with that. But one of the great things about birds is we're all familiar with birds. And when we hear stories about polar bears, that's far away and distant, but birds are right in our yards. So that's that very much personalizes the situation we're in. Thank you, Jillian. Josh.
Yep. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. And on that note, I think I'm going to be able to show some slides of farmers that are in our backyard as well. What I hope to do here is just show a couple data slides and a couple images and really hopefully frame the conversation around how climate change is affecting agriculture, and then hand it off to Abbie, who's the real farmer, and let her talk about the effects on her and other farmers. So let me share my screen here. All right, please let me know if you can't see that, but I'm assuming that you can. All right, yeah. So yeah, a couple key impacts on agriculture in terms of climate change. We know that it's getting wetter. And what's interesting is that when you look at data across the Northeast, you see an annual increase of, an increase in annual average precipitation of about 4 inches over the past century. Not such a big deal. That's multiple generations on a farm and multiple generations to adapt to that increased precipitation. However, when you look at the Vermont specific data, and especially when you look at it over the past 30 years, you see a much different story. And that's what I'm showing in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. You see increases of 5 inches in southern Vermont, 7 inches in the Champlain Valley, 9 inches in the Northeast Kingdom. That level of precipitation increase is significant, and that really has farmers back on their heels wondering how they're going to deal with all that extra water. That excess moisture is having impacts as well, and that's clearly borne out in the risk management agency data that comes from USDA that shows where crop insurance payments were made, which means where crop failures occurred. And here's a pie chart that shows where those payments were made from 2001 to 2010, and it's obvious that the not just the biggest slice of this pie, the over half of this pie is attributed to excess moisture. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that when you look at this same pie chart for regions moving to the west of New England and moving to the south of New England, this pie chart starts to look very different. And that slice of pie that represents drought starts to dominate this pie. But this excess moisture piece is somewhat unique in terms of climate change for New England, for the upper Northeast across the country. And then it's not just that we're seeing more precipitation, it's that those patterns of precipitation are changing. I think Jim and Jillian mentioned this, that we're seeing more extreme storms. And here's a figure from one of the most recent national climate assessments that shows that the Northeast is really, you know, this is our headline story, at least in my eyes, and how I think of climate change affecting agriculture and farms, is that we're seeing 74% increase in these very heavy precipitation events. The rest of the country is seeing this as well, but not to the degree that we are in the Northeast. And it's interesting when I go to farms and I work with farmers, we have, you know, a wide spectrum of farmers in Vermont, you know, in terms of honestly, their politics and their degree of acceptance of climate change. But regardless of where they are on that, they all can agree to this one, that we're seeing storms unlike they were used to seeing when they grew up on that farm, unlike, you know, that their parents had to deal with when they were farming that land. And that is, I think, this kind of common thread that runs across farms and farmers now in Vermont, is this dealing with these extreme events and the challenges that poses for our farms. And then just a couple images. This is me standing in this is a diversified vegetable farm in Chittenden County, Vermont, after one single storm event came through in the summer of 2015. And I have a guilty grin on my face. This is tragic to lose this level of soil from a farm, but I'm a soil and water engineer by training. And to see this level of gully erosion was something that I had never seen in person. I'd only seen in textbooks when I was in graduate school studying the Dust Bowl. And to see this in person was a really, you know, kind of surreal event, but like I said, tragic for the farm. This is what these extreme storms can mean for farms in Vermont. Loss of soil. Soil is, of course, the foundation of agriculture and critical for our farms to maintain that resource and to keep that resource on the farm. And the last photo, this is not just loss of soil from farms that these precipitation changes bring. It's literally loss of productive land. It's loss of pieces of fields from farms. This is a farmer, Geo Honingford in South Royalton, Hurricane Flats farm just after Tropical Storm Irene. And they're just losing entire chunks of the land from flooding within that floodplain. And I think for us in Vermont, we're a very mountainous, hilly state. These floodplain soils are so valuable to us. These are the most productive, the most fertile. They're well drained. They're critical for sustaining a local food system in Vermont. And yet they are the soils that are most vulnerable to flooding and the damage that is caused by extreme events. So these are some of the, so I'll just end there, but I just wanted to kind of frame the challenge for you in terms of what agriculture is facing.
Thank you, Josh. I'm not sure I want to be left there. So that sounds like a pretty difficult situation for farmers, because you're talking about increased precipitation, dramatic events, and at other times increased drought. And we've seen this over the last couple of summers. So, you know, maybe later on you can address, how does a farmer plan for both extremes at the same time? You know, that's quite a challenge. But right now we're going to move on to Abbie. Thank you for Josh and Abbie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight. As my introduction stated, I farm way down on the Massachusetts border in very southern Vermont. For just some local data numbers, last July, we had over 20 inches of rain in the month of July in southeastern Vermont. at the same time as there was a massive drought and massive drought conditions in the Northeast Kingdom and Chittenden County, I believe. So even within our state, we're seeing really marked extremes geographically speaking. So even the challenges that face our farmers in different parts of the state is something that we're going to have to contend with. And the long story short, we need to make sure that we're contending with that. Some of the ways that our systems are set up now, different regions in the state don't have as many resources in terms of what's available to farmers and other folks to implement different changes on the ground. So as it said in my bio, we are an organic dairy. We are unique in the sense that we're at 2,000 feet. And so additionally, one of the realities that we're actually facing as a major component of climate change is the wind, the degree to which gusts are coming. My dad likes to joke that essentially there's, no windbreak between our farm and the Rockies, which on certain days in January certainly feels accurate. We have had sustained gusts for at least a day of 80 to 90 miles per hour, have lost multiple barn roofs because of it. So that's the other really interesting thing about when you're trying to think systemically or policy-wise about farms are so individual. They're truly based where they are, and depending on the management, the products you're raising, or that the livestock that you have, what you're trying to produce there, all of that has to be factored very carefully into how you think about how you're approaching the realities of both your individual microclimate and then also the patterning or the trends that we're seeing in the overall change in the climate in our state. But for a little bit of hope, what I'll say is about 40 years ago, we stopped plowing on this farm. Our entire farm is in what we call permanent sod. We never are disrupting the soil structure. And my dad likes to say that was because he went to UVM and got his degree in plant and soil science, and then spent the next 10 years learning that this farm needed to be farmed how Mother Nature intended her to be farmed, and that it was our job as farmers to read the landscape and the soils and the conditions here and figure out how we could farm in concert, in tandem with Mother Nature versus fighting her at every turn. And since transitioning to that, we became certified organic in 2008. And since 2008 and that certification change we're unique in the sense that we've always been a grazing dairy. There was a period of time where many dairy folks in Vermont did go through a period of full confinement on their dairies. That was not something that we ever did here. And my grandfather actually began rotationally grazing, which is when you move livestock around your landscape to mimic how they would move in a herd structure through a landscape naturally. And he began doing that in the 1960s with wooden fence posts and steel wire, which was quite a project with 27 cows. Now it's much easier for us, but to counter, or not counter, but to give a little bit of hope, right? Because the discussions around climate realities and climate change are, crushingly depressing often. We have seen immense benefit from utilizing livestock in that way and from intensifying the ways in which we move the animals around the landscape. And what that does is over time, it builds up not only the biology in the soil, as Josh was talking about, but also the organic matter in the soil. And the wonderful thing about building up the organic matter in the soil is that it both can assist with the extreme conditions that we face, drought and extreme weather events. We have certainly had a few summers here. I have been back on the farm for 14 years, and climate change has been a reality that I have experienced the entire time I have been back. we have certainly had summers where the amount of water that we have gotten on this farm has been catastrophic, nearly. Even with an organic matter, we average around between 6 and 7% organic matter. Some fields are a little bit lower, some are higher, and Josh might have to help me with this, but it's 1% of organic matter can hold, is it 20,000 gallons more of water or more than that? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a correlation, a corollary between the percentage of organic matter and the amount of water that the soil is able to hold. Essentially, it acts like a big sponge, which is why at 2,000 feet, it's so critical for us to not be plowing or not disrupting the soil structure, because it allows for that sponge to stay that much better intact and absorb. And then in a drought condition like we experienced this summer, when you're grazing in certain ways, when you're leaving more biomass in the field, et cetera, it allows that organic matter in the soil and the functional soil structure that can be built up by rotational grazing, allows for the resilience to let the grass grow back and hold the water capacity even in a drought scenario. So I offer that as a smidgen of hope. I think that agriculture is one of the rare places in the climate discussion where there is massive opportunity and also hope in terms of very tangible and functional ways of making change literally happen on the ground and in the ground. But I guess what I would say in closing up my little intro here or whatever is we need to start to change a little bit the ways in which we approach our thinking about these issues to a more holistic framework. We often are only talking about carbon or carbon sequestration, and that can be a really, frankly, a damaging way to approach this, particularly when you're thinking about natural and working landscapes. They're complex systems and they have to be managed that way. They're also, like I said, very dependent on the soil structure, the topography, the species mix, the diversity, biodiversity that you have in the place that you're managing for. And so it's really critical in how we think about our policies that meet the needs of our farmers on the ground and foresters on the ground, is that they're able to utilize their, Paul Hawken calls it the science of place. In indigenous traditions, it's traditional ecological knowledge, or it's the observational bank that's built up over years of people observing landscape function. And it's taking that knowledge base that the farmers possess of having managed a landscape for a period of time, and all those observations that they pick up with the most current science and technology that we have from, Josh's viewpoint, or, the universities, et cetera, and then melding those together to try to make sure that we're enhancing and bolstering both our landscape function and our ability of our farmers to do that. And sometimes only 2% of the population in the United States are farmers. The average person is 3 to 4 generations removed from the farm. And so the farmer's voice is often the last one that we bring into the conversation. And I think we really need to start bringing that expertise in much sooner to the conversation, because the way that we could then build policy out would tackle both things at once, as opposed to where we sometimes land in this moment, or what I experience often, is that the farmer is the last to be brought into the conversation, and therefore the policies don't necessarily work as we hope that they would, because they haven't been ground truthed with the people who are having to implement the policy that's been put forward. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Abbie. And we're going to get to the policy question in just a moment. Josh, Abbie followed up on a couple of things that you introduced, and she also made the point about that they don't need to plow on their farm, helps preserve the soil. And obviously that's not an option for all farmers. Josh, are there other I don't think it's an option for all farmers, but maybe. But are there other strategies for helping farmers deal with those two contradictory extremes of drought and too much rain at once?
Yeah, great question. You know, I'm guilty of thinking that a lot of solutions are related to the soil. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity there with building soil health and buffering against those drought periods and those extreme events for all types of farmers, whether it's, you know, someone who's annual cropping or in a perennial system. But there are certainly other strategies that one can implement. I also work with vegetable growers, and it is pretty staggering the level of interest in irrigation, not just irrigation, but efficient irrigation, drip irrigation that farmers are starting to invest in because they're seeing more and more of those droughty periods. It's affecting all farms. And it makes good use of their source water when they use those efficient irrigation systems. And then on the flip side for vegetable growers, since I kind of started with vegetable growers, things like high tunnels, hoop houses, you know, these structures that were originally used for season extension are now primarily used to buffer crops against extreme events and excessive moisture. They prevent some of the soil saturation, but they also prevent some of the disease that comes along with those really wet conditions. So those are just a couple examples.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Next question here. So at the statewide level, what are some of the policies and programs Vermont should be promoting to help wildlife and forests to persist in the face of climate change? Jillian, would you like to start for us on this? And any of the panelists who would like to contribute have a chance on this one. Start with Jillian.
Sure. Gosh, and we've like touched on so many things. I would say programs and policies that keep our forests as forests and our farms as farms. So those are policies and programs that work for people. I mean, those are both two working landscapes. And so programs that work for the people and work for those systems to function. A couple examples that Audubon has, we have a healthy forest program that works with private landowners and public landowners to manage their forests in ways that promote birds, but healthy and resilient forests, structurally, compositionally diverse forests. And actually, you mentioned Jim was involved in that program initially in Vermont when it got started, Tom, during the intros, you touched on that. And that program has been very successful in working with landowners to develop management plans for their properties that meet multiple goals. And I think that was, I forget if it was Abbie who mentioned, I think that's important. I don't think there should be, we will lose out if we just focus on one goal or one outcome. It's a matter of meeting the needs of again, landowners and working landscapes to achieve multiple goals. And the Healthy Forest Initiative also has a more specific program for any of the maple producers out there, Audubon's bird-friendly maple program, that is similar, but it's focused on the sugar bush and managing that to make it more diverse and resilient and beneficial for wildlife. And we have a bird and bee friendly farming program, which is new. Actually, I was down at Abbie's farm just a few weeks ago. And we are working with farmers to find ways to promote habitat for pollinators and for birds. And that's, again, intertwined with the other priorities that they have for their farms. So those are a few of the programs that I'm most familiar with. I don't know if any of the other panelists, I can mention some of the policies. I'm not as knowledgeable with some of the policies, like changes in Act 250 that are being proposed. and the 30 by 30.
You gave us a good start on that. Yeah, thank you. Jim, did you want to continue with that?
I guess no, Jillian covered a lot of it, but I will add that, Vermont does have a program, the Vermont the Use Value Appraisal Program, which, it's a program that allows landowners, farmers, and forest landowners to enroll their land, manage it sustainably, and their property taxes are reduced as a result of that. Over 1 million, almost 2 million acres of Vermont productive land is enrolled in that program. So it's really critical, as Jillian said, keeping forests as forests and agricultural land as agricultural land is critical. Because when you convert a forest to, a parking lot, you lose all of those beneficial values for wildlife, as well as the sequestration, that carbon sucking that trees do. So that's an important program, but it's also important to look at that program and think about ways that it can play a role more as a climate mitigator. And, one of the things the legislature did last year was created a forest reserve program within the forest program of the Use Value Appraisal Program, which will allow landowners to manage for longer rotations, older growth forest conditions. And, the science is really showing that, these old forests store and hold carbon at very high rates because of the soil that builds up, the way that Abbie was describing the regeneration of their soils there, which is such an inspiring story to hear, Abbie. I'd love to get out there someday and see it, but that happens in the forest too, right? And so it's holding water, it's holding that carbon, it's a place where wildlife thrives. And so that's like a little tweak that we made just this year, the legislature did, and will give, a wider range of management options for those lands. So that's just another example of policies that we have here in Vermont, but there are many more that we could be looking at that can help, advance connectivity and support landowners in doing the right thing. Just a couple of, if you don't mind, Tom, while I'm on a little bit of a rant here, the Housing Conservation Trust Fund, secures land and helps buy land both in farm and forest land, so supporting that. And then in the other, as we see these flood events happening more often, we should be thinking about ways to protect those floodplains and conserve. So new flood hazard regulations, ways to help communities sort of limit development in those places where we know that they're going to flood, and if people are in harm's way, they're going to be harmed. So how can we change state regulation around that? And then how do we support landowners to give them the resources to set aside the land that's buffers? 75% of our rivers in the state are disconnected from their floodplains. And as Abbie just described, floodplains play a really critical role in mitigating flood, but also are great habitat and great connectors of habitat. And so anything we can do to help landowners get compensated for setting aside that land and protecting it for that critical climate mitigation role that floodplains can play. And I know it's a trade-off between some very productive land, but let's make sure we find ways to compensate that. So those are some other things that we are thinking about at the Nature Conservancy and that policymakers can be thinking about to address this climate crisis.
Okay, thank you. Abbie, you had mentioned, policies and programs. Is there anything you wanted to add at this point about that? I mean, Jillian and Jim gave us quite a few ideas. So if you want to, we have plenty of other questions also.
I could just be a twerp for a second and say that, at least in farming, one of the greatest things that's impacting our future viability in farming and forestry is that there's no bench, there's no next generation. And so, we've lost, like, for example, I have 2 younger brothers, neither of whom are here because they can't afford to be here. So I'm just going to put in my little soapbox plug for, again, as we think holistically about these issues that we face as a state, keeping young working families here is something that's really critical. And policies like childcare and healthcare and things like that allow for young working families to be where, right, farmland often is rural by definition, not always, but often. a lot of our rural schools and rural communities have really been decimated in the last 20 years, particularly. And so when you're thinking about, I frame it as, and the Regenerate America campaign that we put in the chat function that you can take a look at, is when you're thinking about true regeneration, right? Humans are a keystone species. They're a part of this puzzle too. And so we have to think about what it is to fully regenerate our communities, our economies, our soils, our landscapes. And the function of all of those, because we often talk about these things as though humans are apart from our natural systems, but we're not. We're a part of them, and we can help in their function. And so what is it that the humans require to be able to be where they can be in order to grow our food and help us remain food secure? So it's that whole, thinking about the whole and approaching our policy from that framework instead of in the more binary or myopic framework of policy by policy.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the chat, Sherry recommends the movie Kiss the Ground, which is about soil health. I hadn't heard of that one. She says it's a great movie. Stephen Marshall asks, and maybe one of you can answer this, can corn and other Vermont crops be grown without plowing? Josh?
Sure. Yeah. It can. Yeah. Corn is, I think there's been a lot of progress made in growing corn without tilling. A lot of it has to do with that particular weather year, and climate change continues to kind of throw a wrench into the best laid plans, but farmers are making progress with that. The soil texture also has a lot to do with that as well. It's much easier to do that in some of the lighter soils, the coarser soils, than in those heavy clay soils of the Champlain Valley. With vegetable crops, it is possible. There's some amazing things happening on a few farms in Vermont with no-till vegetable production, but that is maybe even a harder row to hoe. So much of the, spring activity on a vegetable farm is really trying to warm up that soil, and tillage helps a lot with that, so that we have a short growing season in Vermont. And so some of that tillage on a vegetable farm helps warm that soil and allows seeds to germinate. And in no-till systems, you don't have that. So there are some challenges, but people are finding ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Ned Swamberg has a few questions in chat. I'll ask the first one here. Can we burn our forests and have them too? How likely is it that we can burn more wood, harvest timber, and meaningfully increase the critical role of our forests as carbon sinks? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Sure, Tom, I'll take it if nobody else is chomping at the bit here. I think this goes back to Abbie's comment about trying to think holistically and stay away from binaries. And I think, there are opportunities for managing our forests in ways that can meet some of our societal needs for paper products, wood products, and provide jobs for our communities in the forest sector. So thinking about, changes that, allow for older trees to stay in the landscape when you're doing harvesting, helping hold that carbon in the forest, so leaving the tops of trees, things like that. And then being, a little selective about the type of wood we are removing for things like firewood and pulp. But, the first thing first is, think, that the forest will grow back if it's managed right, and that growth will help sequester carbon, just maybe not at some of the amounts that an older forest. So it's not an easy, just not cut. That is one way to manage trees, and it's an important thing that we need to be thinking about in Vermont, because we don't have a lot of old forests, and that's a critical ecosystem condition that's lacking. But within that, there's a wide range of other opportunities that we have. So I'm really encouraging people to think holistically and think about our forest as a complex system and think about how we can work within that system to manage in ways that kind of meet a wide variety of societal needs as well as habitat improvement.
Thank you, Jim. So another question from Ned. Maybe we'll get back to the one about birds, Jillian, but one of his other questions is how can we better support farmers working with the land sustainably, food processing, storage, distribution. So basically, what are ways that we can help farmers? Abbie, you want to start?
Sure. So one of the things that we tried to encapsulate within the climate action plan when we wrote it was this need to reframe agriculture. This is going to sound so foolish to those of you assembled, but agriculture as food production. In this state, sometimes in the policy realm, we talk about agriculture as though it is something that is not related to how we have food, which is fair in a state where we do still import a shocking amount of our food. So again, in reframing that, we utilize the Farm to Plate strategic plan, 10-year strategic plan, and incorporated some aspects of that into the climate action plan to try to help policymakers have a bit of a roadmap about thinking about how do you craft a regional food supply. Not that we're not, of course, we're always going to import coffee or mangoes. I mean, assuming that they can grow where that they grow, but how can we better resource our landscapes and our farmers to produce as much food as possible from the landscapes that we do have? And a lot of that is, and I think a lot in these policy discussions is these sort of very basic infrastructure solutions that aren't romantic and they're not exciting and they're not, magic, but they're where are fleets of vehicles? How are the vehicles powered? Where are the slaughterhouses? Where are the aggregation? Where is aggregation happening? How are we distributing different? How is all of our food working together? Have we mapped out, what we can produce and what we can't? And do we understand that? And Farm to Plate is still, and Food Solutions New England is currently working on a lot of that, thinking about what a New England food security plan looks like and how we would go about sort of shifting our systems to better resource ourselves and our farmers in terms of getting the food to our people. For the farmers themselves, again, what I'll say is, so currently we face an organic dairy crisis. Literally, we're losing farms on a daily basis right now. These are often the farms, not always, but they are farms that in general, because of the requirements that come from a USDA organic certified dairy, they have to graze animals and they tend to use more to grow more of their own feed. Although again, that's a generalization, but we're losing these very farms. So first we have to stop, we cannot afford to lose any more of our farms because as Jim said, once they're, or as my friend Chris Campany says often, once those farms go, they're not going to grow back trees, they're going to grow back houses. So, conservation easements, supporting Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and the Vermont Land Trust and being able to be more nimble and getting more of those easements out and functional, and then thinking about how do we help farmers be viable? Again, another thing, this is my soapbox, we talk all the time about infrastructure too. We often forget the farmers as people, but you can't be innovative. You can't adapt. And farmers have to adapt every single day to the living actual conditions on the ground that they're facing. It's very difficult to do that, particularly in the increased challenges we face with climate change when you're not well resourced and have capacity as a human being. So if you're stressed, if you're not mentally well, if you're not physically well, if you can't get the care that you need, all these different components affect how the people that actually feed us are able to do their work. And if we want them to be operating to the fullest capacity, we have to start thinking about them as people too, which we often don't.
Thank you, Abbie. Your comment about when farms disappear, they don't grow back trees. They it becomes houses. And it reminds me of many years ago seeing a slideshow and music presentation about Williston before the big box stores came in, and the farms that were there that were replaced by big box stores. So, which fill a different need, but are not as good for the environment and not as beautiful. So, Josh, did you want to add anything? Abbie gave us a lot of ideas about how to help farmers. Did you want to add anything on that? Or
I'll just say one thing. I mean, buy local. It just can't be said enough. You know, if we want our farmers to be well resourced to handle challenges like climate change, we have to support them by buying their products. And I'll also say, do what you can to increase your agricultural literacy. You know, try to understand why farmers do what they do. And I think that's a good advice to all of us.
okay, thank you. So a couple more things from chat, and Sherry added about the movie Kiss the Ground that she mentioned before. She says it's available on Netflix, but the organization has produced it, has made it available to community showings, including at libraries, and she gives the web address for it. If you haven't scrolled through chat, people have put a lot of links up there to various things. Jillian gave us several links about bird-related organizations. I checked out those websites earlier in the day, and they were really great. And they also have some great suggestions about what we can do as individuals and as landowners to help the cause of helping birds, but also reducing our carbon footprint. Also, Carol Vassar says that Michael Hara, Smart Agriculture, teaches Midwest farmers to use cover crops and no-till while growing corn. Loring Starr asks us to please discuss the role that Roundup plays in no-till corn growing. Josh, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. Yeah. So in many no-till corn production systems that involve a cover crop is planted in the fall. It germinates and it establishes itself, and then in the springtime, it really starts to gain momentum and grow quite a bit. And so then farmers will use a Roundup, a glyphosate product, to kill that cover crop before they plant that subsequent cash crop. And that allows them to deal with that cover crop and any weeds without tilling that soil. Now, people have different views on that practice, but it is part of the system. We have done some research at UVM, and others have done research on alternative ways of terminating that cover crop with things like called a roller crimper. I think we're making progress on that front, but it's not quite ready for prime time. I guess I would say it's kind of in the developmental stages, but as it is right now, Roundup is part of a no-till and cover crop corn system for most farms in Vermont that are using those practices.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Some more things in chat. Lynn Wild has some information, then also a question. Dirt to Soil, Gabe Brown is a very successful regenerative farmer, rancher for the past 25 years. And also Lynn asked, and Michelle Singer does the technology for us on this. And Michelle, maybe you can address this answer in chat or come on the screen and address it for us about being able to save from chat. So can you enable the save chat function? Or is there another way to share this information? I know we've been through this before because it can be hard when you're reading through chat to get down all the information you want when somebody gives a long address, web address. Michelle?
I think I have enabled it, but I'm not sure that I have. To be honest, I've never done that before. So Oh, it's, yeah, I gave the suggestion that I've actually, opened those tabs up in my computer so that I have them open and know where to go again. But I'll keep working on enabling people to save the chat because there's a lot of really great information in there.
Okay, thank you.
And if anybody knows exactly how to do it, please message me.
Okay. Oh, we have so many questions, and I have a whole list of additional questions from the presentations from our panelists too. So an issue that we were talking about earlier before we started in a different way, looking beyond lifestyle issues like reducing our carbon imprint by walking and biking more, by driving an electric or more efficient vehicle, and by improving the efficiency of our home heating systems and taking measures like that. Are there steps that individual landowners can take to combat negative climate change trends? So those of us who are landowners, homeowners, besides that house, we also have a lot around us. So would any of you like to start on that? Things we can do as individuals who are landowners. Jill.
Get us started.
Jillian, sorry.
That's okay. So, and I'm sure landowners, everyone has probably a different type of landowner, but reducing your lawn and planting natives. There are a lot of different resources online in terms of natives that you can plant. But even looking, depending on, again, what your property is, whether it's relatively small or even larger, if you have any sort of riparian areas where you can plant trees and shrubs. When it comes to pollinators and birds, there is information online just even about the types of plants that you can plant that provide food sources at different times of year. So you can be selective and intentional about what you plant, so you have things blooming at different times of year. Reducing the use of pesticides would be another one, but those are a few. I could keep going.
That's a good start for us. Did anybody else want to jump in? Jim?
I guess, Tom, I'll add for folks who own a woodlot, have, some acres that you're managing, maybe you're in the current use program. The Nature Conservancy League put out a guide to climate smart forestry that you can check out. I think Michelle has the link that you can pop into the chat that we'll try to save, right? A couple things to be thinking about. Get to know those plants that we call invasives, and be somewhat aggressive about going after those. These are introduced plants that are not native to our state, are pretty aggressive about expanding and can crowd out that native plant population. And the downside of that is that you're crowding out the next forest that may be coming along, and there's a whole lot of wildlife that is impacted as a result of that too. Other things you can think about, this may be a little controversial, but if you are someone who hunts or are thinking about hunting, I would encourage you to get into the sport. Our deer need some management in the state, and what we see at the Nature Conservancy in parts of the state where on our preserves, deer management is that the deer have, they're exploding, their population is exploding, and they're literally eating through the next generation of forest. And so it's a way to get local meat and lower your carbon footprint by being a hunter who also respects the other land, the landowners in it. So there's a whole role there, but I would encourage people to also think about that as one thing they can do to play a role in helping our wildlife adapt to climate change.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So that the question I just asked you assumes that individuals have an important role in this. And I think that most Vermonters feel that way, especially people who are participating tonight. However, there are people in Vermont who have argued, especially when people have proposed programs that require people to change their lifestyle. Some Vermonters argue that Vermont is too small to address such a large global problem, and that any efforts that we make are futile. can you, any of you like to comment on that? That criticism that maybe, you know, Vermont state government shouldn't be trying to conquer this because it's a worldwide problem. What are we going to do with our 630,000 people? Jillian, you look like you're ready to go.
You gotta start somewhere, and why not be the model for what other states and make states, you know, envious of what Vermont can achieve and accomplish. There's no doubt that these issues are a lot bigger than me or an organization or Vermont. I mean, that's, you know, there's, you know, global conferences on this, but you start somewhere, you make a difference, you get engaged, you talk about it. I mean, I love Joshua's, you know, recommendation of getting informed, getting familiar with ag and how it works, but even just these issues and what is on Vermont's docket for the year and which ones you think are going to make a difference in terms of policies. And then when you go and visit friends and family in other states, you're sitting around the table over the holidays and you chat about this stuff. So you be a voice and a model.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more, Jillian. I will also say, you know, climate change is not something that's happening far away. It's happening everywhere, and it's happening in our backyard. And we heard tonight, just, you know, from Abbie and Joshua, how we're seeing the impacts in our own communities and economies. And so I would say that it's incumbent on all of us as individuals to play a role in that and to help our policymakers make good decisions to address this crisis, as well as help us adapt to the changes that are coming. So, you know, it's a part about kind of being a good neighbor as well. And that, you know, Vermonters pride themselves on being good neighbors. Well, good neighbors look out for each other and they help each other. And it's time for us all to help each other and step up.
Thank you.
And I look at our size as being an advantage. I mean, you can look at it as a disadvantage, but we're also small enough that we're nimble and we can change, where a lot of larger states have a lot of trouble making.
It looks like Josh froze. Oh,
I'll jump in just
earlier. He was having trouble with internet, and then it hasn't happened. Oh, you're back.
Oh, there he is. Are you back, Josh?
Abbie, why don't you answer it, and then when Josh is back. You're back? Okay. Josh, go ahead.
I don't know what you heard or you didn't hear. I was just saying I think small is good. Sometimes it means we're nimble. So yes. I'll leave it at that. Yep.
Thank you. Abbie?
All right.
I think it's the perfect example of think globally and act locally. I mean, you can only be where you are, and that matters, right? The little steps do matter, even if it's just that it helps with, again, I think these conversations can evoke quite a lot of desperation or anxiety, certainly, and feeling like you're connecting with other people around moving these issues forward or talking about them or helping to educate around them, I think can be a really powerful way to feel like you're a part of the solution, even if it is, you know, quote unquote, in just a small way. The one thing that I would also say with Vermont, or a tiny tweak, I hope that we can help lean into over the next years as we plan out how we think about this, is really the resilience and the adaptation components of climate change. Mitigation is really important, but, you know, an electric car can't save me if I'm floating down the Connecticut River in the next flood. So I think there's a balance in terms of how we're tangibly approaching this with policies that both help reduce the literal emissions that are coming from our lives as Vermonters, but also the ways in which we're building up our adaptive capacity as humans within our communities, and then the resilience within both our communities and our landscapes to the changes that, as Jim said, you know, are coming and are here already.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And in chat, Jean Mastriano reminds us of the great Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So also in chat, Suma Lashef recommends a website on Vermont invasives. It says it's very helpful. So, and from Michelle, I'm happy to email that the chat to anyone who wants to after the program ends. So Michelle can email the chat to you if you would like to get all the information that people have listed there. Lynn Wild also mentions, are any folks or farmers collecting rainwater in cisterns during high rainfalls to hedge against drought periods? Homeowner can do that. Can a farmer do that?
Certainly there are lots of different ways to think about water storage and capacity within a farm's infrastructure. I will say that I do think this is an area that, and you'll see this reflected in the climate action plan, that we're a little bit behind on in terms of how our ability to meet farmers' needs in this regard. Particularly, we often don't think about water system and hydrology within a farmscape, and so our technical service programs and such aren't necessarily designed to meet that need yet. I think, and Josh obviously would know this a little bit better than I, but I think we're getting there, and I think we're learning. But again, as a place where the excessive moisture tends to be the thing that, as farmers, certainly we're more often battling, I'm not sure that we've given as much concrete and deliberate thought to thinking about water within a farm's landscape. There are small groups of people working on it in different places, and there's really promising, some people working on thinking about keyline design, which I don't have time to explain right now, but the functionality of landscapes and how water moves within them, but in a farm's context. So there's a lot of potential there, and I think I would imagine it's an area that we will explore much more in the next 5 years.
Yeah, thank you. And Lynn adds that having lived in Texas, cisterns were a way of life on many ranches and farms. And of course, it's been a need out there for as long as people have been living there. So maybe it's one of the possibilities that could be considered in Vermont as we move forward, as things have changed. So one of the other questions, Josh was recommending that people get informed about agriculture, and Abbie was noting that 2% of Americans are farmers, and most of us are a few generations removed from being a farmer. So how does a Vermonter, besides talking with people at farmers market, how do Vermonters become informed about agriculture?
I think talking to farmers is always a pretty good start.
Mhm.
I think, which I think that there's a lot of work going on around that. There's increased efforts around agritourism, which, depending on which farmer you talk to, is either the best thing that's ever happened or the worst thing that's ever been invented. That really depends. But I think it's like with anything else or any of the solutions to this, it's relational, right? It's getting to know the people. If you have a farmer or there's a farm in your community, okay, maybe tread carefully going to see them, or maybe give a call first, because sometimes farmers can kind of be, we work alone a lot of the time. We're isolated by nature. So, maybe give us a heads up. But I think that for the most part, there is a desire on the part of Vermont's farming population and a wish, really, that people did want to understand from our perspective what we're seeing and how we're trying to grapple with it. Because, there are a lot of narratives that exist that can cause a lot of damage when they're not understood in the proper context. Josh and I, we could have a whole 14 talk series about the nuances of no-till vegetables versus no-till corn versus perennial polyculture grasses. it's just talking to the people in your community, same as, understanding anything else, I think, and seeing them as another human within your community that you want to try to understand.
Okay, thank you. A few people have listed information in chat about home water collection systems they have. We won't have time to get to all of those, but please look through chat and you can find them. Jillian, you gave us a few different websites relating to birds and also things that individuals can do. Are there any particular websites of those that you would recommend? I seem to remember at least 3 of them had sections on things you can do.
Yeah, just one? Why can't I say all 3?
No, you can do more than one.
There's the list I gave was there's the State of the Birds report, which came out pretty recently, and a number of different bird conservation organizations contributed to that. And State of the Birds is pretty easy to remember, but that was in the chat. And that has some recommendations. And the other one was the 3 billion birds. There's a number of what you can do listed on there as well.
Okay, thank you. So Michelle is just reminding me it's almost 8:30. So we're going to do 2 really quick questions. First, any of the panelists, is there anything that you still want to add that has come up this evening or something you thought of afterwards that you didn't get to? That's the second to the last question. If you have something, Jillian? Oh, you just unmuted yourself, so I thought you were ready.
Oh, sorry.
No. Anybody?
I guess I would just say that there's nuance with all of this. There is no silver bullet in terms of how we're going to navigate our way through this. And I think it's really important in these moments to really remember that, as particularly when you're talking about natural systems, that there is no one size fits all. And it really needs to be an exchange of information between the people that are doing the work and the people who are creating the systems by which the work is done. And that needs to be a constant back and forth if we're going to really try to move forward and become resilient and adaptive.
Thank you, Abbie. Anyone else? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. What I heard over and over tonight is like Vermonters' ability to adapt to a changing system, and we're showing that. And nature's trying to do the same thing, and so let's keep that in mind as we do management. We may not do it right today, but let's do it, and let's be willing to change as we go along and as things adapt around us. And so I encourage everybody to be adopt a spirit of experimentation and courage to move forward. And I'm encouraged that Vermonters are the ones to do this because they have shown it already that they're willing to be out on the edge and start tackling some tough stuff.
Okay, thank you. So last question, like each of the panelists, take a turn at this one. So this is the first part of this has already come up tonight. Climate change sometimes feels dire and overwhelming. So the question for you is, can you point to something that is giving you hope that these trends can be improved? When you unmute yourself, you can go. Anybody who wants to go first?
I mean,
Abbie?
honestly, or Jim, go ahead.
Go,
I don't
Abbie.
Honestly, I find hope every day in the landscape around me. Since we have, every time we sort of double down on just trying to pay attention to what's going on within our landscape around us, we see amazing results. The biodiversity that I see, the increases in bird population since going organic and not using nitrogen fertilizer, the explosion in the types of species in our grass mix, like these changes are possible. And I think, humans are made to be adaptable. And so we have the capacity to meet this moment. And I think it's just, I witness hope every day. And I think often it's just going outside.
Thanks, Abbie. So 1 minute or less, Jim.
There's one category of birds where the numbers aren't going down. Those are wetland birds. And that's because we have invested and focused on trying to restore the populations. And that's an example of when we put our mind to it and we make the investments necessary, we can reverse some of these trends.
Thank you. I noticed that looking at one of the websites that you recommended earlier. Thank you for bringing that up. Jillian, and then we'll give Josh the last word.
Yeah, I'll build off of what Jim said, because I think there's a lot of examples of successes within birds. I mean, I mentioned it earlier. I mean, bald eagle, Vermont just delisted it. That bird was, practically extirpated from the Northeast and has had a comeback. Again, it's about us kind of going to what Abbie said, being open and having conversations, and Jim being willing to experiment with things to see if we can make a difference. But the bald eagle and other raptors, the waterfowl, like Jim mentioned, are excellent examples to give us hope. And even a little bit closer to here, I mean, piping plovers, for those who don't know, there's a population in the Great Lakes, and it was in New York State, up in upstate New York on Lake Ontario about 30 years ago. Who would have thought the birds suddenly returned? And those are birds, they weren't born there. This is like the investments and efforts to help that species. It grew and they dispersed and they, reestablished themselves in places they hadn't been for over 30 years. So lots of reasons and stories of hope in the bird world.
Good, thank you. Josh.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit different tact. I mean, we're gonna slow this train down and turn it around. But until then, I am just so encouraged by Vermont farmers, and this is a really difficult place to farm, and they are the most adaptable, resilient people that I've ever dealt with. And so have complete faith that they're going to adapt and deal with climate change and keep producing food until us as a society slows down climate change and stops it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Michelle, as you do your closing, could you let people know how they can get this information? The information that's in chat.
Yeah, so I will email people, but I will also put it on the adult programs page of the Kellogg-Hubbard Library website. That's where you will also find the place to register for the next 3 talks, which are going to be on climate change and social justice, on current legislative initiatives, and a focus on youth and what can we do. So those will all be on the adult programs page of the Kellogg-Hubbard Library website.
And Michelle, if somebody wants you to email the chat to them, should they put a message in chat? Is that how to do it?
Yeah, they can message me privately. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But I can also lift all these websites out of the chat and put them on the website so anybody can go there and find them.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. I've enjoyed this, and a great group of panelists: Jillian Liner, Joshua Faulkner, Abbie Corse, and Jim Shallow. Thank you so much. And thank you to Peg Elmer Huff of the League of Women Voters and Michelle Singer, the Kellogg-Hubbard Library. This has been an enjoyable hour and a half. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us for the evening.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.